by saying Avi Noam created a relationship with Henry Kissinger and the JPPI. He brought him at one point for a master's class. We had another retreat where he and I engaged in a conversation, and it reflected something about Avi Noam's vision for the JPPI. Leading figures internationally who were Jewish, he wanted to bring them in as thinkers. He wanted to bring them in and have them offer not only wisdom, but in a sense, sharpen the kind of relationship between this institute and leading Jewish figures internationally. And I don't know that anybody could have done it more effectively than Avi Noam. It makes me happy to pick up on these kinds of conversations again as we celebrate his retirement. I see that Dr. Kissinger is there. I want to welcome you. I want to continue discussions you and I have had in the past. I want to start with a broad question for you. If you look historically, populism has always been connected to a kind of xenophobia, an extreme nationalism that almost inevitably rejects immigrants, rejects the other, and Jews have always been the quintessential other. The structural factors that have contributed to this latest period of populism, do you think that they're on the wane, or do you have a concern that the kind of populism that we've seen internationally, do you see that it's not bound to go away anytime soon, or do you feel that we're looking at a period now where we may see some changes?
Well, first, let me express my gratitude to Avi Noam and to the Institute for bringing me together with Jewish concerns and Israeli concerns on a regular basis, and encouraging me in certain activities that were helpful. And when on visits to Israel, or when Avi Noam came to America, to talk to me, not just an intellectual, but as somebody with a shared destiny and a common task. So it is very meaningful to me that you gave me an opportunity to continue a conversation which we had on Long Island a while ago under the auspices of this institute. And so thank you for this opportunity. Do I think anti-Semitism is on the rise? In certain parts of the world, in Europe, it is certainly on the rise. In some other regions, I think anti-Semitism is a kind of cover for expressing dislike of the European and Western world, and it becomes a kind of a substitute for something they don't dare to do explicitly. But the improvement of means of communication have fostered something they didn't need much fostering to begin with. So I fear that anti-Semitism is on the rise. Not yet in America to the same extent, but even in America, one can see signs of it. And for somebody like me who grew up in Nazi Germany, it's a worrisome experience.
Let me take you to a subject that you have thought a lot about, the kind of structure of the international order. You are someone who has written a lot about the balance of power in world order. You are a disciple of Hans Morgenthau. When you first became the National Security Advisor in 1969, you saw not only a split between the Soviets and the Chinese, but you saw the Soviets massing forces on the border. And your inclination was to draw closer to the Chinese on the grounds that they were the weaker party. You ended up producing what was a breakthrough in building a relationship, establishing a relationship with China. The Soviets themselves took account of that and obviously then had a greater interest in détente as a result. I wonder if you look at the realities today where China is the rising power, is the global economic power. Would you take that construct of the balance of power? And does that have an implication for what we do in this triangular relationship between Russia and China today?
Well, the principle that my associates and I used to talk about was that it was in our interest to be closer to both of them than they were to each other, because that gave the United States the greatest influence. And I've been explicit about that to both the Chinese and to America and to Russia. Now we are in a situation where China is grown in power so that it is intrinsically more capable of working in a direction that is not necessarily compatible with ours. But I actually do not agree with the current tendency that builds China into a permanent enemy, because the danger is that we will wind up isolating ourselves, giving other regions an opportunity to play us off against China. And China has had a historic tradition of considering itself the central kingdom. And therefore, when they became more powerful, these historic tendencies have reappeared. But they're not necessarily aimed at us. We cannot permit another country to be in a hegemonial position. That is a basic principle, should be a basic principle of our foreign policy. But I believe it is in our national interest to maintain a relationship with China in which we understand each other's fundamental concerns, cooperate on some issues, where we have to oppose on other issues. But the fundamental split with China that so many advocate today, I consider extremely dangerous.
Let me take that logic and apply it more to the Middle East right now. I want to bring up Iran, and I want to ask you, I want to quote you, which is always a good thing to do. You once said that Iran has to decide, is it a cause or is it a country? Many draw the conclusion that because the Islamic Republic continues to act as if it's a cause and not a country, that the only answer is regime change. I wonder, I mean, if we look historically at America's efforts at regime change, they're not exactly happy experiences. I wonder if the logic of somehow having a relationship with them still makes sense. What would be your approach to the Iranians? This is obviously an issue that creates a lot of concern within Israel. What would be your approach to the Iranians? If not regime change, how would you seek to try to change the Iranian behavior?
Well, before the current regime came into power in Iran, the United States, as well as Israel, had very good relationship with Iran. And so when Iran conducted itself as a national state, with its pursuing its national interests, there were no incompatibilities between their conduct, their relationship, and ours. Now, the regime is practicing a policy which is a combination of traditional imperialism and radical Islamist views. Again, an Iranian regime that carries out national Iranian policies can find compatible relations with, of course, with America. And in terms of history, also with Israel. The fundamental danger that Iran represents organically right now is the development of nuclear weapons. And the possession of nuclear weapons by Iran is incompatible with a stable Middle East and with a stable relationship with the United States, and represents, in terms of its own pronouncements, a fundamental threat to Israel. So, in principle, I could imagine negotiating with the current regime if it changes its attitudes, but they don't seem to find it possible to give up this combination of Islamism, imperialism, and threat. And so the test case is the evolution of nuclear capacities in Iran. If those can be avoided. And so I don't say that we could not possibly talk to this regime, but we should not fool ourselves. I don't believe that the spirit, and I wrote about it at the time of the previous agreement, with a time limit, with so many escape clauses, will do anything other than bring nuclear weapons all over the Middle East, and therefore create a position of latent tension that sooner or later will break out, because Israel and other countries in the region don't have the margin of survival that America has. They cannot afford a mistake because they only have one chance. And so from that sense, I can imagine there's no inherent reason why one should not be able to live in peace with Iran, other than the combination of weaponry and ideology that now exists. That is an absolute.
It sounds as if what you're suggesting is, on the one hand, the Iranians must know that militarily we and others would act if they look like they were moving towards a nuclear weapon, while we combine that with containment and then see if there are any circumstances under which they would be open to a negotiation that produces the kind of results you're talking about. What is interesting about the Iranian posture that you describe of being both a kind of revolutionary power and an imperialist one within the region is that it's produced this remarkable convergence of strategic interest between Israel and most of the Sunni Arab leaderships. So we now have this a new dynamic where we have 4 Arab states that have normalized with Israel. It really promises to change the landscape of the region, not only vis-a-vis the Iranians, but actually towards the region itself and even on the Palestinian issue. If you were doing what you used to do, if you were Secretary of State again, how would you try to take advantage of this normalization process between the Arabs and the Israelis? How would you try to build on it? And what would you encourage the incoming Biden administration to do?
Well, Dennis, you and I have talked about this for a long time. And I want to congratulate you for your contribution to thinking on these issues and the enormous efforts you have made to the thinking of everybody concerned with this region. I believe we should continue on the road on which we are now. The Arab states have learned or come to the conclusion that their national interests transcend their ideological interests, that their survival as societies cannot be maintained in a state of constant tension with parts of the West and with Israel. And so they have decided, and Israel has advocated it also, that they should pursue the interests they can develop in common together, and that they will take into account Arab concerns where they clash, and even make an effort to meet some of these concerns, as long as they stay within the framework of compatible and mutually supportive efforts. It has worked out very well. Therefore, I have always been, as you know, advocating to stay away from all-out solutions and to work on the solutions that we can, because they will build on themselves. And I think this is even true of the Palestinians. Because if the Palestinian issue becomes, it's discussed only in terms of the ultimate aims, it will never bring any progress, because they are to some extent incompatible. But within that, there are important elements. And the Jewish and Palestinian people can live together. And if that is emphasized in the Palestinian negotiations, and if in the rest of the Arab world it is demonstrated that constructive relationships are possible, and therefore we have to be careful that if now we begin moving towards conciliating Iran, not to give up what has been achieved recently in these agreements between the Arab world and the Israeli world. So we're on, I think, we're on And that's what I would tell the current incoming administration.
You and I could continue this conversation for some time, but we have a schedule to stick to, so we'll conclude it at this point. I want to thank you personally for taking part, but also I want to thank you for the interest you've always shown in the JPPI and your readiness to take part both in Israel and the United States on events that the JPPI sponsored. So thanks, good to see you virtually. I hope someday to see you directly and personally. But in the meantime, thanks very much for taking part and for this, I think, very interesting discussion.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for what you are doing, and all good wishes to Avedon.